learners, and welcome to the 7th lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. In this lecture, we will introduce the discussion of a key theme in this course, which is a style or a genre of 20th century poetry, which has remained very popular. And in fact, it is a very old genre, but it was rejuvenated in the 20th century. It got a new lease on life and has continued to remain extremely popular and well respected even today. That genre is titled the elegy. I will introduce a little bit the genre itself, as well as talk a little bit about why that genre gained a new degree of interest and value in the 20th century in particular. So, as I've mentioned in my previous lectures, 20th century poetry was defined both by the poems themselves as well as the declarations, articulations, and the self-conscious views of poetry published by its practitioners as a poetry and a century of newness. Poets like Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot spoke and wrote a lot about how the poetry of the 20th century was characteristically modern. By modern, they meant different from what was written before. And this effort producing newness in poetry defined a lot of poetry that was published in the 20th century. So while we can call the 20th century of poetry as the century of newness, there is something about the century of newness and the century of powerful, memorable, moving poetry that was written. There's something about that poetry which gives us pause and forces us to reconsider whether it really was a century of such newness as claimed, or was there something else going on? This is necessary because the genre of the elegy is a very, very old genre. And this genre survived many such assaults and attempts on the old, and attempts to turn the old and make it new. So the study of the elegy and its evolution in the 20th century also allows us an opportunity to reconsider and to think and carefully understand what does it mean for modern poetry to call itself new. The newness of modern poetry can be seen in the way the elegy was reinvented and continued to be rewritten and continued to be read, enjoyed, celebrated, and continued to remain a very powerful medium in the 20th century. Newness consisted in rewriting old forms and in finding the value of old forms even as the times changed. The fate of the elegy, the evolution of the elegy, allows us to revisit this modernist dicta of make it new. To begin understanding this process, I will read from the last two stanzas of a very old poem. The poem is titled Lycidas by John Milton. This was published in the year 1673. And this poem is about two stories. The first story is the literal story in the poem, which is that farmers, shepherds, actually mourning the loss of a peer, of a friend, of someone who worked with them. The name of this person is Lycidas. This person has passed away, he has drowned, and everyone is sad. The poetic persona, the narrator of the poem, takes these shepherds on a process of consolation, on a process of acceptance, on a process of reconciliation, and finally, a process of acceptance of grief and acceptance of loss. That is essentially the story of the poem. This poem was inspired by a real-life incident, the death by drowning of Edward King, a friend and a college mate of the poet John Milton, who, while a student at Cambridge, experienced this loss. Milton experienced the loss of Edward King, who died by drowning. And this death produced this reflection. So we can see that there are several degrees of grief involved. And from the way the poem ends, we will get a very important sense of the lasting theory and the lasting mechanism of the elegy in the English literary historical tradition. The elegy is a particular system and a mechanism for representing and processing loss. How does that system work? What is the way that this poetic genre allows individuals, human beings, experiencing loss, to reconcile themselves to that loss, to process that loss, to get on with their lives, to function as human beings? Because loss interrupts the normal functioning of human bodies. And yet, to stop permanently, to be trapped in loss, is not an option for most of us. So the imperative, the functional imperative in the experience of loss is to function. And that is a struggle because there are compelling tendencies, there are compelling forces which ask us to not function, but to give ourselves over to the friend or the memory of the friend or loved one that we have lost. And therefore, the struggle to move on, to function, is very real. In this poem, we see one instance of a poet offering us a strategy for describing, but also processing and functioning through that loss. So here is how Milton ends this poem, Lycidas. Weep no more, woeful shepherds, weep no more, for Lycidas your sorrow is not dead. Sunk though he be beneath the watery floor, so sinks the day in the ocean bed, and yet anon repairs his drooping head, and tricks his beams with new-spangled ore, flames in the forehead of the morning sky. So Lycidas sunk low, but mounted high. Though the dear might of him that walked the waves, where other groves and streams along, with nectar pure his oozy locks he leaves, and hears the unexpressive nuptial song. In the blessed kingdoms meek of joy and love, there entertain him all the saints above. In solemn troops and sweet societies that sing, and singing in their glory move, and wipe the tears for ever from his eyes. Now, Lycidas, the shepherds weep no more. Henceforth thou art the genius of the shore, in thy large recompense, and shalt be good to all that wander in that perilous flood. Thus sang the uncouth swain to the oaks and rills, while the still morn went out with sandals grey. He touched the tender stops of various quills, with eager thought warbling his Doric lay. And now the sun had stretched out all the hills, and was dropped into the western bay. At last he rose and twitched his mantle blue, tomorrow to fresh woods and pastures new. So we can see in these words that the poet is offering the grieving shepherds a justification, a logical explanation, logical within the workings of this very powerful emotion, but logical nonetheless, an explanation for why they should not grieve. They want to grieve because Lycidas, a loved one, a compatriot, a brother, a friend, has died. And they are so struck and so interrupted and disturbed by this loss that they don't want to do anything. They don't want to get on with their lives and their jobs. The poet consoles these grieving shepherds by saying that Lycidas may be dead, but he is also alive. How is he alive? He is alive because he is like the sun. As the sun rises, so Lycidas rises. And this is the meaning of the word, so Lycidas sunk low, but mounted high. He has sunk low because he has died by drowning, but he is mounted high because he is everywhere. He has transcended his material, fleshly existence and has become a part of nature. Like the sun rises, and like the sun enables other natural growth, the growth of trees, flowers, crops, grains, etc. Basically, all of nature, the way the light and the power of the sun creates the natural world around us, in the same way, Lycidas is alive. The memory of Lycidas enables this imagination, the happy memory, the memory of the happiness that was produced in Lycidas' company while Lycidas was alive. that memory enables his imagination of Lycidas as being a part of the sun and enabling all the beauty, the calm, and the peace that nature has created around the poet. And this explanation is not only an opinion of the narrator, but it is also something that the shepherds find persuasive, because what happens at the end? The shepherds decide to get up, decide to start a new day with fresh woods and new pastures. Right? They decide to get on with their jobs, which involves tending to nature, tending to livestock. So this is a complete theory of how successful mourning can be described and advocated for in poetry. The poem is not simply a description of how others mourn, but it is a two-way traffic between the poet's own process of grief and a description of how that process of grief can enable others to process their grief. Right? Now, there is a very influential theory of how such writing, that is, elegy in the style established by John Milton, how this kind of a poetic strategy can enable the processing, the description, and the management of grief. That theory is inspired by the work of Sigmund Freud. Now, in the year 1917, Freud wrote an essay titled Mourning and Melancholia. The German title is Trauer and Melancholy, in which he established a very powerful theoretical distinction between these two terms, mourning and melancholia. Now, Freud presents both mourning and melancholia as responses to loss, but differentiates them in terms of their psychological mechanisms, symptoms, and underlying unconscious processes. So first, there is mourning. Mourning, in Freud's view, constitutes a somewhat normal response to loss. We will come to this normal word later and describe how it is not very profitable and it does not take us very far. But nonetheless, in Freud's view, in the year 1917, mourning constituted a normal response to loss. And how was it normal? Freud describes mourning as a reaction to the loss of a loved one, or an abstraction, or something similarly significant. That is, it is not just a person's death that can produce mourning, but also the loss of a homeland, the loss of freedom, the loss of an ideal, or something significant. In Freud's words, mourning is regularly the reaction to the loss of a loved person, or to the loss of some abstraction which has taken the place of one, such as one's country, liberty, and ideal, and so on. Now, in Freud's frame, mourning involves a conscious recognition of loss, leading to a gradual withdrawal of emotional investment from the lost object. The grieving individual experiences sadness, preoccupation with memories of the deceased, and a temporary disruption of their normal activities. However, this disruption is seen as natural and eventually results in the individual moving on. In Freud's words again, reality testing has shown that the loved object no longer exists, and it proceeds to demand that all libido, that is emotional energy, shall be withdrawn from its attachments to that object. That is, over time, the ego successfully detaches from the lost object and normal emotional life resumes. So the object disappears and there is a vacuum which causes disruption, discomfort, pain, because there is a lot of libido that is attached to an object which no longer exists. This disturbance is replaced by the withdrawal of libido from that lost object and the attachment of that libido onto a new object. This is a somewhat mechanistic view of emotions, and this is in line with the early 20th century nascent frame in which psychology and psychoanalysis was. Melancholia, on the other hand, shares some symptoms with mourning, such as sadness and withdrawal, but is far more severe and has distinctive features. Melancholia produces a profound sense of guilt and self-reproach. In Freud's words, in mourning it is the world which has become poor and empty. In melancholia, it is the ego itself. It's a very powerful language. In mourning, there is a sense that We are sad because something from our world has been taken away from us. The world is empty because the object in which we had invested our self is gone. In melancholia, the sense is even deeper and more severe because we feel that it's not the world that has been emptied, but rather it is ourself. So it is a much more disorienting and difficult state to be in. Now, in Freud's frame, unlike mourning, melancholia is often not linked to a clearly recognized loss. The individual may not even be consciously aware of what has been lost. Freud suggests that melancholia involves an unconscious loss, often due to the loss of an ambivalently loved person or ideal. So there is a further sense that the degree of emotional investment in the object that has been lost is under doubt. In mourning, there is no doubt about the degree of emotional investment. We are sad because we feel that we have lost someone we loved. In melancholia, that loss is deepened and turns into a sign of self-questioning. We not only are sad for someone we have lost because we thought we loved them, but we also begin to question how much did we love them. In Freud's words, the ego turns against itself. The patient presents his ego to us as worthless, incapable of any achievement, and morally despicable. He or she reproaches themselves, vilifies themselves, and expects to be cast out and punished. So there is a very powerful degree of masochism that attaches itself to grief. The melancholic subject, as opposed to the mourning subject, blames themselves, starts to lose their bearing on what has actually happened. They start to blame themselves and denies themselves the consolation, the comfort that a grieving person would naturally deserve. Freud argues that these self-reproaches in melancholia are actually directed at the lost object, but since the object has been internalized, the accusations are turned inward. In Freud's words again, the self-reproaches are reproaches against a loved object, which have been shifted onto the patient's own ego. Now, this theory, Freud's distinction between mourning and melancholia, should be clear enough. At this point, let us think about one very influential work of literary criticism, which takes this theory and uses it to formulate an understanding of a literary genre, that is the elegy. Now, this work is credited to Peter Sachs, the scholar of English literature, who published this book in 1985 titled The English Elegy, Studies in the Genre from Spenser to Yeats. This is a very influential work which draws heavily on Freud's ideas from mourning and melancholia and applies those ideas to create a theory and a system for how the elegy functions in English poetry. Sachs's argument is that elegies enact a psychological process similar to Freud's conception of mourning, helping both poets and readers work through loss. If you think briefly to the quote from Lycidas that I read out, one can easily treat Milton as if Milton was a patient, as if John Milton was a patient suffering from an emotional or a nervous condition and had come to a psychoanalyst like Freud. And Freud's advice to Milton, and this is a fictional scenario which I'm simply extending as a thought experiment to help clarify exactly how Peter Sachs's argument about elegy works. Now, let's imagine that John Milton came to Sigmund Freud's clinic complaining of this emotional condition. What is the condition? Milton has lost a friend. He is unable to function. He is so sad. He is blaming himself that he couldn't do anything more. Maybe if he had acted differently, his friend would have been alive. He's trapped in his own self-reproachment and is unable to function. It is causing a great deal of pain. And Freud's advice to this ailing patient is to simply remove his emotional investment from the lost object and to find a new object in which he can be emotionally invested. It is not to say that Milton should forget Edward King or that forget that how much he loved and how much he continues to miss his friend. Rather, Milton should direct his emotional energies towards something like writing, something like his words, something like his own memories, his own account of what that friend was, the happy times they shared. And this shift in the emotional investment can help Milton work through his loss and find some happiness, not in the fact that Edward King has disappeared from his life, but in the fact that Edward King once was in his life. The two shared a wonderful, happy experience, and in the future, everyone has to pass, and everyone will eventually become a part of the universe. That is, just like Edward King has passed and become a part of Milton's natural surroundings, similarly, one day Milton himself will pass and join the natural surroundings, and both Edward King, his lost friend, and Milton himself, the poet, remembering, mourning, will become like two stars, will become like two parts, two elements of the natural world. Now, if Milton were to take this advice seriously, and if the result of this advice can be understood to be the poem Lycidas, then we have understood and we have articulated and clarified Peter Sacks's argument from the English elegy. Let us try and understand in more detail how elegy becomes a work of mourning. Sacks aligns elegy with Freud's notions of mourning, where the bereaved gradually detaches their emotional investment, that is their libido, from the lost person. Sacks suggests that elegies symbolically reenact this process by moving from expressions of grief toward consolations or poetic closure. Much like Freud's idea that mourning follows a structured trajectory leading to recovery, the elegiac tradition, that is the history of English elegy, often transforms sorrow into poetic form and communal remembrance. So this is key. The poem transforms what is simply sadness into a poetic form and communal remembrance. In a way, there is a new object. The person has disappeared, the poem has appeared. Okay? Now, it may be unfair, and some of you may be thinking that it is not fair to replace a person with a poem. Yes, that is true, and this is exactly what many modern elegists, 20th-century elegists, poets that we will study, will argue. But we are not yet in the 20th century. We are trying to understand how a style of writing, a form of remembering, a form of grieving, when translated into literary composition, how that form enables us to create new objects. So while the memory of the dead friend Edward King makes Milton very sad, the written poem Lycidas makes Milton less sad, and it may go from making Milton less sad to making Milton a little bit happy. And this happiness, however diffused, however unconscious, however mild and muted it may be, comes from a communal remembrance. Everyone remembers not simply how much Milton grieved and how Milton was paralyzed and disabled by his grief, but they remember how Milton made an effort to transform his grief into poetry. And they remember how Milton remembers Edward King and how much from this memory of his friend, a great poem emerges, a poem about, not simply about grief, but about a universal truth. What is the universal truth? The truth that we are all here to die, we are all born to die, as the popular song goes. But that fact that we are born to die should not make us despondent or should not paralyze us. In fact, the fact that one individual person is born to die should unite us, should make us feel much more at home in this very universal existence. So the fact that Edward King has died turns into this realization that human existence is short And the material existence of human beings may be short, but it can become the occasion for a long and almost eternal existence of our memories in words. And this is somewhat similar to the way the natural universe uh, dies and regenerates and continues this cycle of death and regeneration. The fact that Milton remembers Edward King through Lycidas, a poem about shepherds, a poem about tending to nature, means that the short human existence is replaced and united with an eternal universal existence. We will continue our discussion of Peter Sacks's argument. We will briefly wrap up what Peter Sacks has to say about the elegy as a unique literary form, and then quickly move on to some examples of 20th century elegy which contrast powerfully with Milton's poem and help us inaugurate this great and powerful 20th century of elegies. Thank you.